They said I wasn't real family at my own father's funeral. Not in those exact words. Nobody is ever quite that direct when they want to wound you and still appear respectable in front of the other mourners. What my Aunt Pamela actually said, standing beside the casket in her black Chanel suit, was this: "It's so sweet that you came, given everything. Blood really does matter at times like this, doesn't it?" I was 34 years old, standing 6 feet from my father's body, and his sister had just informed me, in front of 40 guests, that I didn't belong in this grief. I had been adopted by Richard Whitfield when I was 4 years old. He was the only father I had ever known. My biological parents existed only as a closed file somewhere in a county records office I had never bothered to request access to, because Richard Whitfield was my father in every way that mattered. He taught me to ride a bike, sat through 11 years of piano recitals where I was decidedly mediocre, walked me down the aisle at my wedding, and called me every single Sunday at exactly 4 in the afternoon for 30 years without missing a single week, even when he was traveling, even when he was sick, even during the year my mother was dying and grief had hollowed out everything else in our lives except that one unbreakable ritual. But to Pamela, and to my cousins, and to the extended network of Whitfields who had spent 3 decades treating me with the specific, polished coldness of people who consider themselves too well-mannered to be openly cruel, I would always be the asterisk. The adopted one. Not really a Whitfield. Not real family. I want to tell you about the day I found out exactly how wrong they were. But first, I need to tell you about the 30 years that led up to it, because the satisfaction of what eventually happened only makes sense if you understand the particular, accumulated weight of everything that came before. My name is Eleanor, though most people call me Nora. I was 4 years old when Richard and Margaret Whitfield adopted me from a county foster system in Ohio, after 2 years in placements that I remember only in fragments: a yellow kitchen, a dog named Buster that wasn't mine to keep, the specific quality of being moved from place to place without anyone explaining why. Richard and Margaret had tried for years to have biological children and were unable to. They told me, when I was old enough to understand, that adopting me wasn't a consolation prize or a second choice. It was simply how I came into their lives, and they considered it exactly as meaningful, exactly as permanent, as any other way a family gets built. I believed them completely, because they gave me no reason not to. My childhood with the Whitfields was, by any reasonable measure, happy. Stable. Loved. Richard ran a successful architecture firm that he had built from nothing over 30 years. Margaret taught high school English until she retired. We lived in a comfortable colonial house in a Connecticut suburb, took vacations to Cape Cod every August, and had Sunday dinners that I genuinely looked forward to. The trouble was never inside our immediate household. The trouble was the wider Whitfield family, Richard's siblings, his parents while they were alive, the cousins and aunts and uncles who populated holiday gatherings with a specific brand of old money New England reserve that masked, just barely, a hierarchy of belonging that I was never quite permitted to forget. I remember the first time I understood I was different. I was 7, at a family reunion at my grandmother's house in Massachusetts, and I overheard 2 of my older cousins talking in the hallway outside the bathroom. "She's not really our cousin though," one of them said. "She's just the kid they adopted." I didn't fully understand the weight of that distinction at 7. I understood it more by 9, when my grandmother gave each of her biological grandchildren a piece of antique jewelry that had been passed down through 4 generations of Whitfield women, and gave me, instead, a gift card to a bookstore, kind, certainly, but unmistakably different in category. I understood it more by 12, when I noticed that family photographs displayed in my grandmother's house consistently excluded me unless my parents were also in the frame, as though I existed only as an extension of them rather than as my own person within the family. By the time I was a teenager, I had developed a kind of internal radar for these moments, small, deniable, impossible to call out without sounding paranoid or ungrateful, but unmistakable once you learn to recognize the pattern. A comment about real Whitfield features that I obviously didn't share. A family tree project at a reunion that listed every biological relative going back 6 generations and simply wrote adopted next to my name with no further detail, as though my entire existence before age 4 was a footnote rather than a life. My parents noticed some of it. Richard, in particular, would get a specific tightness in his jaw whenever Pamela or his other siblings made comments that toed the line of unkindness, and he would occasionally pull me aside afterward to tell me, quietly, that I was as much his daughter as any biological child could have been, that blood was meaningless compared to the years of love and presence that actually built a family. I believed him. I still believe him. But believing your father's love doesn't erase the daily experience of being treated as slightly less legitimate by everyone around him, and over 30 years, that accumulation does something to a person. It teaches you to expect less. It teaches you to brace yourself at family gatherings. It teaches you, eventually, to stop trying quite so hard to prove a belonging that apparently could never be fully earned anyway. The incident that crystallized everything, the one I think about most clearly when I trace the path to what eventually happened, occurred when I was 26, at my cousin Davidson's wedding. It was a lavish affair at a country club outside Boston, the kind of event where the Whitfield family's old money and careful social positioning were on full display. I attended with my then fiancé, Marcus, excited to be part of a genuine family celebration, hopeful that this milestone moment might finally feel like unambiguous inclusion. During the reception, my Aunt Pamela gave a toast that focused extensively on Whitfield blood and 3 generations of family legacy continuing through Davidson's marriage, language that felt, even in the moment, designed to draw an invisible line between the people in that room who carried that blood and the people who didn't. Afterward, during the dancing, I overheard Pamela talking to one of her friends near the bar. "It's a lovely wedding, isn't it? Keeping the family line going properly," Pamela said. And then, lowering her voice slightly but not quite enough, added, "Not like with Richard's situation. Sweet girl, of course, but it's different when it's not actually your blood, isn't it? You always wonder, deep down, if there's some piece missing." I stood frozen for a moment, holding a glass of champagne I suddenly had no interest in finishing, processing the casual cruelty of a comment that suggested, definitively, that 30 years of being raised by Richard and Margaret Whitfield had left some essential, unbridgeable gap that biology alone could have filled. I didn't confront her that night. I told Marcus what I'd heard, and he was appropriately furious on my behalf, but I made the calculation I had been making my entire life regarding the Whitfield family's casual unkindness, that confronting it directly would cause more disruption than it was worth, that I would be labeled difficult or oversensitive, that the safer path was simply to absorb it and move forward. I want to be honest about the cost of that pattern, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came later. Every time I absorbed one of these moments without confrontation, I was making a quiet trade, trading my own dignity for a kind of fragile peace within a family that, I was slowly beginning to understand, had never actually offered me peace in the first place. They offered conditional tolerance, dressed up convincingly enough to pass for acceptance most of the time, but revealing its actual shape whenever they felt sufficiently unobserved or sufficiently entitled to say what they truly believed. My father died when I was 34, after a brief, brutal illness that took him from diagnosis to death in just under 5 months. Those months were, without question, the most painful period of my life, watching the man who had taught me to ride a bike and called me every Sunday for 3 decades slowly disappear into a hospital bed, his voice growing weaker, his presence growing fainter, until the calls stopped entirely and I understood, with a grief that still catches me unexpectedly even now, that I would never hear him say my name again. The funeral took place on a gray October morning at the same Episcopal church where my parents had been married 40 years earlier. I had spent the previous 5 months essentially living at the hospital, managing his care, coordinating with his doctors, handling the increasingly complex logistics of his decline, while the wider Whitfield family, Pamela, my cousins, the various aunts and uncles, visited occasionally, sent flowers, and otherwise remained at a comfortable emotional distance from the actual, grinding work of watching someone die. I want to be precise about this point, because I think it matters enormously for what eventually happened. I was not a peripheral figure in my father's final months. I was the person who held his hand through chemotherapy sessions that ultimately didn't work. I was the person who learned to manage his medications, who sat with him through nights when the pain was too severe for sleep, who made the impossible decisions about hospice care that fell, by default, to me because I was the only child he had, biological or otherwise. And yet, standing at his casket on that gray October morning, surrounded by family members who had done a fraction of that work, Pamela had still found the specific cruelty to remind me, in front of 40 mourners, that blood mattered more than any of it. "It's so sweet that you came, given everything," she'd said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure several nearby relatives heard clearly. "Blood really does matter at times like this, doesn't it?" I didn't respond in the moment. I simply nodded, the particular numbness of grief making confrontation feel impossible, and turned back toward my father's casket, focusing on the immediate, overwhelming task of surviving my own father's funeral rather than litigating 30 years of accumulated slights in real time. But something had shifted in me, standing there. Something that had been slowly cracking for 3 decades had finally, definitively, broken. Because what Pamela didn't know, what almost none of the extended Whitfield family knew, because Richard had been characteristically private about his estate planning, was that 3 years earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of treatment after his death, my father had made a series of decisions about his trust and his estate that would, eventually, reveal precisely how much blood actually mattered in determining who Richard Whitfield considered his real family. The reading of his will and the disclosure of his trust documents were scheduled for 2 weeks after the funeral. Pamela attended that meeting with the same confident, entitled bearing she'd carried throughout the entire funeral process, clearly expecting the kind of substantial inheritance that 30 years of careful social positioning within the family had led her to anticipate. She had absolutely no idea what was actually in those documents. She had no idea that I did. She had no idea that her casual cruelty at my father's casket, the latest entry in 3 decades of comments designed to remind me of my supposedly conditional belonging, was about to collide with a reality she had never once considered, that my father, the man whose blood she'd spent 30 years insisting mattered more than mine, had spent the final years of his life ensuring that his trust, his legacy, and his name belonged entirely and unambiguously to the daughter he had chosen. Regardless of what biology said about the matter. I had learned about my father's trust restructuring 18 months before he died, though not in the way you might expect, not through any grand, deliberate conversation where he sat me down and explained his intentions. Richard Whitfield was not a man who announced his decisions with ceremony. He simply made them, quietly and thoroughly, the same methodical way he had approached every architectural project of his career, and trusted that the right people would understand his reasoning when the time came. I found out almost by accident, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when I drove him to an appointment with his estate attorney because his hands had started shaking too much for him to trust himself behind the wheel, though he hadn't yet told anyone the full extent of what his doctors were beginning to suspect. The attorney's name was Harold Beckett, a precise, silver-haired man who had handled the Whitfield family's legal affairs for over 20 years and who greeted me with the particular warmth of someone who had watched me grow up through occasional family events and legal proceedings I'd been peripherally involved in over the years. "Eleanor, good to see you," he said, and then, glancing at Richard, added, "Should I step out while you two talk, or would you like her in the room for this?" Richard had waved his hand dismissively. "She can stay. She should probably understand what we're doing anyway, since she'll be the one dealing with all of it eventually." I want to tell you that I immediately understood the significance of that meeting, but the truth is more complicated. I sat through an hour of dense legal conversation about trust structures, beneficiary designations, and estate tax implications, understanding perhaps 60% of the actual content, focused mostly on the more immediate, frightening reality that my father's hands were shaking badly enough that he needed me to drive him to legal appointments, a development that felt like an early tremor of losses I wasn't yet ready to fully process. What I did understand, even in that moment, was the general shape of what Richard was doing. He was restructuring the Whitfield family trust, a trust that had been established by his own father decades earlier and that, under its original terms, would have distributed assets according to a fairly standard formula favoring biological descendants and their children, with provisions that Harold described, carefully, as somewhat antiquated in how they defined family membership. The original trust language is quite specific, Harold explained, pulling out a document with sections highlighted in yellow. It defines beneficiaries as blood descendants of Walter Whitfield, that's your grandfather, Richard, and their lawful issue. Adopted children of subsequent generations aren't explicitly addressed, which creates some ambiguity about Eleanor's status under the original terms. I remember the specific, cold feeling of hearing that sentence, the recognition that somewhere in a legal document I'd never seen, drafted decades before I was even born, there existed language that potentially excluded me from a family trust simply because of how I had come into the Whitfield family rather than anything about who I actually was or what I had contributed. That's exactly why we're doing this, Richard said, his voice carrying a firmness I rarely heard from him in ordinary circumstances. I want this fixed. I want it unambiguous. I don't want there to be any question, after I'm gone, about whether my daughter has the same standing as anyone else in this family. What followed was a restructuring that I only fully understood in its complete scope much later, after Richard's death, when Harold walked me through every detail during the formal reading of the trust. But the broad outline, established that Tuesday afternoon and finalized over the following months, was this: Richard had created an entirely new trust structure, separate from the original Whitfield family trust that Pamela and the other relatives were still operating under assumptions about. This new trust explicitly named me as the primary and, in fact, sole beneficiary of his personal assets, assets that included not just the substantial savings and investments he'd accumulated over a successful 40-year architecture career, but, more significantly, his 30% ownership stake in Whitfield and Associates, the firm he had built from nothing and that several of his nephews, including Pamela's son, currently worked for under the assumption that family ownership would eventually transfer to them through the traditional bloodline. I need you to understand something, Richard said to me, after Harold had stepped out of the room briefly to retrieve additional paperwork, leaving just the two of us. This isn't about punishing anyone. I'm not doing this out of spite toward my sister or my nephews. I'm doing this because you are my daughter, in every single way that has ever mattered to me, and I am not going to let some outdated trust language, or anyone's outdated ideas about what real family means, determine what happens to everything I built after I'm gone. I remember sitting in that office, feeling a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief. Gratitude for the clarity of his statement, grief for the underlying reality that he felt the need to make it so explicit, so legally bulletproof, precisely because he understood, as clearly as I did, exactly how the wider family would react if given any ambiguity to exploit. Pamela's going to be furious, I said quietly. Richard had almost smiled at that. Pamela has spent 30 years making sure you understood you weren't quite equal to her children. I'm not particularly concerned about her feelings on this matter. The trust restructuring took the better part of a year to finalize properly, involving multiple meetings with Harold, careful coordination with the architecture firm's other partners to ensure the ownership transfer would be legally sound and wouldn't create complications for the business itself, and a level of precision that, I understood later, was entirely deliberate. Richard wasn't simply leaving me an inheritance. He was constructing something specifically designed to withstand exactly the kind of challenge that Pamela and the other relatives would inevitably mount once they understood what had actually happened. They're going to claim I wasn't of sound mind, Richard said during one of our later meetings, with the particular dry humor he maintained even as his health began declining more visibly. They're going to say you manipulated a dying man. I want every single document so thoroughly ironclad that there's no legal avenue for any of that nonsense to succeed. Harold had nodded seriously at this, explaining the additional steps they were taking, independent psychological evaluations confirming Richard's full mental competency at the time of each major decision. Video recordings of certain key meetings where Richard explained his reasoning in his own words, multiple witnesses present for crucial signings, a paper trail so comprehensive that any future challenge would face what Harold described as essentially insurmountable legal obstacles. I didn't tell anyone in the wider family about any of this. Richard had asked me explicitly to keep the details confidential until after his death, partly because he didn't want to deal with the inevitable conflict and pressure that would emerge if Pamela and the others learned about the restructuring while he was still alive, to be lobbied, guilt-tripped, or otherwise pressured to reconsider. "Let them find out when it's already done," he said. "When there's nothing left to argue about except the reality of what I've already decided." So I carried that knowledge silently through the following 18 months, through family gatherings where Pamela made her usual comments about real Whitfield blood, through holiday dinners where I was introduced, yet again, with that subtle linguistic distance that always somehow separated me from full belonging, through my father's increasingly visible decline that none of us could fully ignore as his final year progressed. I carried it through his diagnosis, delivered on a Thursday afternoon in a sterile oncology office that I will remember in painful detail for the rest of my life. I carried it through 5 months of treatment that everyone, including Richard himself eventually, understood wasn't going to change the ultimate outcome, simply extend the timeline by some uncertain number of weeks or months. I carried it through his final hospital stay, when his voice grew too weak for our Sunday phone calls and I simply sat beside his bed instead, holding his hand, listening to him breathe. And I carried it through his funeral, standing at his casket, when Pamela delivered her casual, devastating comment about blood mattering more than anything else. I want to be honest about something that I've thought about extensively in the time since. In that exact moment, standing at my father's casket, I did not think about the trust. I did not think about vindication or consequence or the eventual reckoning that Pamela's comment was unknowingly setting into motion. I simply felt the raw, immediate pain of losing my father combined with the equally raw, immediate pain of being reminded, even in that moment of profound grief, that some people would always view my belonging as conditional and contestable. It was only later, driving home from the funeral in the gray October rain, that I allowed myself to think about what was coming. Not with satisfaction, exactly, the situation felt too laden with grief for anything as simple as satisfaction. But with a kind of quiet, settled clarity about what the next 2 weeks would reveal, and about the particular, specific way that my father had chosen to answer, definitively and legally, a question that Pamela and the rest of the Whitfield family had spent 30 years asking in increasingly cruel, increasingly casual ways. The reading of Richard's will and trust documents was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after the funeral, in Harold Beckett's downtown office. Pamela had specifically requested that the reading include the extended family, herself, her husband, her 2 adult children, my other cousins from Richard's late brother's side, and various spouses, rather than the more private, immediate family-only reading that might have been customary. I understood, attending that meeting, that Pamela's insistence on a larger audience wasn't about transparency or family unity. It was about ensuring that whatever inheritance she anticipated receiving would be witnessed and validated by the widest possible audience, cementing her status within the family hierarchy in front of everyone who mattered to her sense of social positioning. She had no idea that she was about to learn, in front of that same wide audience, exactly how much her 30 years of casual cruelty toward me had actually cost her. We gathered in Harold's conference room on a cold November morning, 10 days before what would have been Richard's 68th birthday. Pamela arrived in another expensive suit, settling into her chair with the same confident bearing she'd carried throughout the funeral process, clearly anticipating a substantial inheritance that would confirm what she'd always understood to be her rightful position as Richard's closest surviving sibling. Harold began, as these meetings typically do, with some preliminary explanations about the documents being reviewed and the general structure of what would be discussed. And then, with the careful, measured precision of a lawyer who had spent over a year preparing exactly this presentation, he began walking through the actual contents of Richard Whitfield's final trust and estate plan. I watched Pamela's expression shift, slowly and then with increasing speed, as Harold's explanation progressed, from confident anticipation, to confusion, to a dawning, horrified comprehension of what was actually being described. "I'm sorry," Pamela interrupted, perhaps 15 minutes into Harold's presentation, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there at the start. "Are you saying that Richard's entire personal estate, including his ownership stake in the firm, goes to Eleanor?" "Entirely. There's nothing for the rest of the family." Harold paused, glancing briefly at me before responding with the same careful, professional neutrality he'd maintained throughout the meeting. That's correct. Richard restructured his personal trust 18 months before his death, naming Eleanor as the sole beneficiary of all personal assets, including his 30% ownership interest in Whitfield and Associates. This trust is entirely separate from the original family trust established by Walter Whitfield, which continues to operate under its existing terms for other family members. But Richard's personal estate, his savings, investments, and most significantly, his firm ownership, belongs, in full, to Eleanor. The room had gone completely silent, the particular silence of people recalculating, in real time, everything they had assumed about their own financial futures and social standing within a family hierarchy that had just been fundamentally rewritten. "This is absurd," Pamela said, her voice rising now, the careful, controlled composure she'd maintained throughout the funeral process finally cracking. "She's not even his real daughter. There must be some mistake, some way to challenge this." He couldn't have been thinking clearly when he made these decisions. He was sick, he was dying, surely you can see how vulnerable he would have been to manipulation. I felt something settle inside me at that exact moment, not anger, exactly, though there was certainly anger present, but something closer to a long-awaited clarity, a sense of finally arriving at a moment I had been unconsciously preparing for across 3 decades of small, accumulated slights. "Pamela," I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, "I think you should let Harold finish explaining the documentation. There's quite a bit more detail you should probably hear before you decide whether you want to pursue any kind of challenge." Harold cleared his throat and returned to the documentation with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had anticipated exactly this reaction and prepared for it accordingly. "Before anyone considers a legal challenge," he said, "I think it's important that everyone in this room understand the full scope of what Richard did to ensure this trust would withstand exactly the kind of contest you're describing, Pamela. Because I can tell you, having handled estate litigation for over 2 decades, that what we're looking at here is about as legally bulletproof as it's possible for a trust to be." He opened a thick folder and began laying out documents across the conference table with methodical precision. First, independent psychological and cognitive evaluations. Richard underwent 3 separate assessments by board-certified geriatric psychiatrists at 3 different points during the restructuring process, at the beginning, at the midpoint, and immediately before the final signing. Each evaluation confirmed, unambiguously, full testamentary capacity. He understood exactly what he owned, exactly who his natural heirs would be under default succession rules, and exactly what he was choosing to do instead. Pamela's jaw tightened, but she said nothing yet. Second, Harold continued, every significant meeting during this process was recorded on video, with Richard's explicit consent, specifically so that his reasoning would be preserved in his own words, in his own voice, free from any possibility of claims that someone else had influenced or fabricated his intentions after the fact. He gestured to a laptop that had been sitting closed at the end of the table. "I'd like to play one of those recordings now, if everyone is amenable." Richard specifically requested that this particular recording be shown if there was ever any challenge to his decisions. Nobody objected, though I could see Pamela's hands clench slightly in her lap. Harold opened the laptop and pressed play. My father's face appeared on the screen, thinner than I remembered him being even at that point in his illness, but his eyes were sharp, his voice clear and deliberate. "My name is Richard Whitfield," he said, looking directly into the camera. "Today is March 14th. I am of sound mind, I understand the nature and extent of my assets, and I am making this recording specifically because I anticipate that certain members of my family will attempt to challenge the decisions I'm about to describe, on the grounds that I was somehow confused, manipulated, or incapacitated." He paused, and even on the small laptop screen, I could see the particular firmness that had characterized him throughout his life, the same expression he'd worn negotiating contracts for 40 years. "I am leaving my entire personal estate to my daughter, Eleanor. Not because anyone convinced me to do so. Not because I am confused about who my family is. I am doing this because Eleanor has been my daughter in every meaningful sense for 30 years, and because I have watched, for those same 30 years, as certain members of my extended family treated her as somehow less legitimate, less deserving, less truly Whitfield than her cousins, simply because of how she came into this family rather than anything she has done or failed to do. Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. I noticed my cousin David, Pamela's son, staring fixedly at the table rather than meeting anyone's eyes. I am specifically aware, Richard continued on the recording, that my sister Pamela has made comments over the years suggesting that adopted children somehow possess less claim to family belonging than biological ones. I want to be unambiguous about my own position on this matter, recorded here for anyone who needs to hear it directly from me, in my own words. While I was completely capable of articulating my own wishes, blood has never determined who I consider my real family. Presence does. Love does. The accumulated weight of 30 years of Sundays and bike rides and recitals and hospital rooms does. Eleanor has given me every single one of those things, consistently, for 3 decades. That is what made her my daughter, and that is what makes her my sole heir. The recording continued for several more minutes, with Richard walking through specific provisions of the trust, the reasoning behind transferring his firm ownership specifically to me rather than distributing it among nephews who currently worked there, and explicit instructions to Harold about how to handle any future legal challenges. When the recording ended, the conference room remained silent for what felt like an uncomfortably long stretch of time. "This doesn't change anything," Pamela finally said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "People can be manipulated even while appearing lucid. There are still grounds to challenge undue influence." "There are," Harold agreed evenly, though I should mention that Richard anticipated this specific argument as well. "Which brings me to the third piece of documentation I'd like to share." He pulled out another folder, thinner than the first. "This is a detailed accounting, prepared by Richard himself with my assistance, of every interaction between Eleanor and himself during the 18-month period of trust restructuring. It documents, with dates and witnesses, that Eleanor was informed of the broad outline of his intentions only after the major decisions had already been substantially finalized. She did not draft this trust. She did not request this restructuring. She learned about Richard's specific plans largely after the fact, through conversations that were, themselves, witnessed and documented." He looked directly at Pamela. "In short, there is no evidentiary basis for an undue influence claim, because the documented timeline doesn't support the narrative that Eleanor pressured or manipulated her father into these decisions. If anything, the documentation shows the opposite, a father who made these decisions independently, then informed his daughter of them, rather than a daughter who orchestrated decisions in her own favor." Pamela's husband, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "Pamela, perhaps we should discuss this privately before deciding on next steps." "There's one more thing," Harold said, before the room could shift into private deliberation. Richard specifically anticipated that some family members might consider pursuing litigation regardless of the strength of these protections, understanding that legal challenges can sometimes succeed simply through attrition, forcing the other party to spend enormous resources defending a clearly valid trust until they eventually settle just to avoid further costs. He pulled out a final document. To address this possibility, Richard included a no-contest clause with unusually specific teeth. Any beneficiary under the original Whitfield family trust who initiates legal action challenging Eleanor's inheritance under this personal trust will automatically forfeit their existing interest in the original family trust as well. In other words, any attempt to challenge what Richard left to Eleanor puts at risk everything that family members currently expect to receive from the older, separate trust established by Walter Whitfield. I watched the specific calculation happen across several faces around the table, the realization that pursuing a fight against my inheritance would risk losing inheritances they currently considered secure, inheritances that, for several of my cousins, represented substantial portions of their anticipated financial futures. "This is extortion," Pamela said, though her voice had grown noticeably quieter. "This is estate planning," Harold corrected calmly. "Quite thorough estate planning," designed by a man who understood his family well enough to anticipate exactly this conversation, and who took every available legal measure to ensure his actual wishes would be honored regardless of how uncomfortable certain people might find them. The meeting continued for another hour, working through the more mundane details of asset transfer, tax implications, and the practical mechanics of how my new ownership stake in Whitfield and Associates would integrate with the firm's existing partnership structure. But the fundamental shape of what had happened was already clear to everyone in that room. Richard Whitfield had spent the final 18 months of his life constructing a legal framework so comprehensive, so carefully anticipatory of every possible challenge, that the family hierarchy Pamela had spent 30 years carefully maintaining had just been completely and irreversibly rewritten. After the meeting concluded, as people began gathering their things and preparing to leave, my cousin David approached me quietly near the door. "I need to say something," he said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "I've worked at the firm for 6 years. I always assumed that ownership would eventually transfer through my mother's side of the family, the way these things usually do. I think I always knew, somewhere, that the way everyone treated you was wrong. I just never said anything, because it was easier not to." I looked at him for a long moment, recognizing something genuine in his discomfort that I hadn't necessarily expected. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "Though I should mention, since you'll find out soon enough anyway, that I have no intention of disrupting your position at the firm. Whatever ownership stake I now hold doesn't change the value of the work you've done there, or your future there, assuming you continue to do good work." He looked visibly relieved, though I noticed Pamela watching our conversation from across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between resentment and a grudging recalculation of what my new position within the family actually meant for her own future relationship with me. Pamela did not, ultimately, pursue legal action. Whether this was because Harold's documentation had convinced her any challenge would fail, or because the no-contest clause's risk to her existing trust interests proved too significant a deterrent, or some combination of both, I never fully learned, because we never discussed it directly. She simply, quietly, did not contest the trust, and the assets transferred to me over the following months exactly as Richard had specified. But something had fundamentally shifted in how the wider Whitfield family related to me, in ways that revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly how conditional their previous behavior had actually been. The change happened slowly, and then, within a matter of months, almost completely. Pamela called me 3 weeks after the trust reading, her voice carrying a careful, recalibrated warmth that I recognized immediately as performance rather than genuine sentiment, but that nonetheless represented a startling departure from 30 years of careful, polished distance. "I wanted to check in," she said. "See how you're doing, with everything. The funeral, the estate matters, all of it. It's been such a difficult time." I let the silence stretch for a moment longer than was comfortable before responding. "I'm managing," I said simply. "Grief takes the time it takes." "Of course. Of course." Another pause. "I also wanted to say, I think there's been some miscommunication over the years, about how the family has treated you. I hope you know that whatever differences existed, we've always considered you family." I felt something cold settle in my chest, listening to her attempt this particular revision of 3 decades of documented behavior, this retroactive softening of comments I remembered with painful clarity, comments about blood matching, about real Whitfield features, about the specific gap that adoption supposedly left unfilled. "Pamela," I said, my voice steady, "I think we both remember those 30 years fairly differently, and I don't think this is a conversation we need to have right now. I appreciate you calling. I need to go." I hung up before she could respond, recognizing in that exact moment something important about my own healing process, that I did not owe anyone, including Pamela, the emotional labor of pretending her sudden warmth erased decades of genuine, accumulated harm. Her behavior had changed because my circumstances had changed, not because she had developed any actual insight into the wrongness of her previous treatment. That distinction mattered enormously to me. Over the following year, I watched this pattern repeat itself across the wider family in various forms. Cousins who had barely acknowledged me at holiday gatherings began reaching out with sudden, transparent interest in reconnecting. Invitations to family events that had previously felt obligatory and chilly became warmer, more frequent, more insistent. The specific linguistic distance that had always separated me, introductions that emphasized my adopted status, conversations that subtly excluded me from full Whitfield belonging, largely disappeared, replaced by a careful, conspicuous inclusion that felt, to me, almost more uncomfortable than the previous coldness had been. Because I understood exactly what was happening. I had become, through circumstances entirely of my father's making rather than my own scheming, someone with significant financial resources and a meaningful ownership stake in a successful business. The family's sudden warmth wasn't really about me at all. It was about repositioning themselves favorably with someone who now possessed influence and resources they hadn't previously needed to court. I want to be honest about how this realization affected me, because I think it's more complicated than simple vindication or satisfaction. There was something genuinely painful about watching, with such clarity, exactly how conditional my family's affection had always been. About understanding that 30 years of careful exclusion had never actually been about anything intrinsic to me, but about a calculation of social and financial positioning that simply hadn't favored inclusion until my circumstances forced a recalculation. I spent considerable time, during that first year after my father's death, working through this realization with a therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chin who specialized in family estrangement and complicated grief. She helped me understand something that I think matters enormously for anyone who has experienced this particular kind of conditional belonging. You're allowed to set boundaries with people based on their actual behavior toward you, she told me during one session, not based on what they're currently performing now that circumstances have changed. The 30 years of treatment you experienced were real. The recent shift in their behavior doesn't erase that reality, and you're not obligated to pretend it does simply because acknowledging the truth feels uncomfortable for them now. This guidance shaped how I navigated the following years of family relationships. I did not cut off contact entirely with Pamela or my cousins. Richard had specifically said, in that recorded message, that he didn't want his decisions to fracture the family irreparably, and I tried to honor that wish where I reasonably could. But I also did not pretend that everything was suddenly fine, that 30 years of casual cruelty could be erased through a few months of strategic warmth. I attended family gatherings selectively, on my own terms, without the desperate hope I had carried for decades of finally earning unconditional belonging. I maintained cordial, professional relationships with my cousins, including David, who continued working at Whitfield and Associates and who, true to my word, experienced no disruption to his position or trajectory there. I declined Pamela's increasingly frequent invitations to more intimate family events, recognizing that I no longer needed to perform the role of grateful, hopeful outsider perpetually seeking inclusion that had never been genuinely offered. The firm itself transitioned smoothly under the new ownership structure, with Harold's careful planning ensuring minimal disruption to daily operations. I took on a more active role in certain strategic decisions, working closely with the firm's managing partners, finding, somewhat to my own surprise, genuine satisfaction in continuing the institutional legacy my father had spent 40 years building. About 18 months after the trust reading, I made a decision that surprised even me. I used a portion of my inheritance to establish a scholarship fund, administered through Whitfield and Associates, specifically for students from foster care backgrounds pursuing degrees in architecture or design. I named it the Richard Whitfield Foundation Scholarship, and I made the explicit, deliberate decision to highlight, in the program's public materials, that it was created by an adopted daughter in honor of the father who had never once, in 30 years, made her feel like anything less than completely, unconditionally his. The first recipient, a young woman named Jasmine who had grown up in the same county foster system I had once been part of decades earlier, sent me a letter after receiving the scholarship that I still keep in my desk drawer, that I read on particularly difficult days when old wounds resurface unexpectedly. I always thought, she wrote, that the family you're born into is the only one that really counts. Reading about your story, about your father, made me understand something different. Family is built through choice and consistency, not just biology. Thank you for showing me that's possible. I think about my father often, particularly on Sundays at 4 in the afternoon, when the absence of his weekly call still creates a small, specific ache that I don't expect will ever fully disappear. I think about 30 years of accumulated small cruelties, comments designed to remind me of conditional belonging, holiday gatherings where I learned to brace myself against casual unkindness disguised as polite conversation. But mostly, I think about a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting in Harold Beckett's office, watching my father's hands shake too much to drive himself to a legal appointment, listening to him explain, with quiet, unshakable conviction, exactly why he was restructuring his entire estate to ensure that no one could ever legally question whether his adopted daughter deserved the same standing, the same inheritance, the same fundamental belonging as any biological child could have claimed. He never confronted Pamela directly about her 30 years of comments. He never had the dramatic, satisfying conversation where he told his sister exactly what he thought of her casual cruelty toward his daughter. That wasn't his way. Instead, he did something more permanent, more legally unambiguous, more impossible to argue around than any conversation could have been. He made his position completely clear through the most concrete mechanism available to him, ensuring that his actual wishes regarding family and belonging would be enforced by law long after he was no longer present to enforce them through simple paternal authority. Pamela had stood at his casket and told me that blood mattered more than anything else, in a moment clearly designed to remind me, one final time, of my supposedly conditional place within the family she had spent 30 years carefully maintaining. She had no idea that my father had already, definitively, answered that exact question 18 months earlier, in a way that made her casual cruelty not just hurtful, but factually, legally, irreversibly wrong. That was her last mistake, not because I orchestrated any particular consequence in response to it, but because it revealed, with painful clarity, exactly how little she understood about the daughter my father had actually raised, and exactly how completely he had already settled, in his own quiet, methodical way, the only question that had ever truly mattered. I was his daughter. Not despite being adopted. Not as some lesser category of belonging that required constant proving and reproving across 3 decades of careful performance. Simply, unambiguously, his daughter, in every way that mattered, recorded now in documents so thorough and so legally bulletproof that no one would ever again be able to credibly suggest otherwise. If you've ever been told, by someone who should have loved you unconditionally, that you didn't quite belong, that some essential piece was missing, that blood mattered more than the years of presence and love you actually gave, I want you to know that their narrow definition of family was always their limitation, never your inadequacy. Leave a comment if this story reached something in you. Tell me about the family you built, whether through blood or through choice, and what that belonging actually means to you. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories like this one waiting.